Welcome back to the Christ the King podcast. I'm Canon Francis Altieri, a priest of the Institute of Christ the King, Sovereign Priest, currently serving in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I'm here with my confrere Canon Edward Gardner, the
Hello.
rector of St. Mary's Shrine in Oswego, New York. We've been speaking previously about the doctrinal import of the kingship of Christ, right? The main theme of this encyclical Quas Primas, whose 100th anniversary we are commemorating this year. And we began to talk a bit about the kingdom of Christ, which is the church. And the fact is that the reality of Christ's kingdom does not subsume the other earthly realities over which Christ is king. So in this segment, what we want to talk about more is the earthly consequences of Christ's kingship. That is to say, the ordered relationship between the kingdom of Christ in this world and the kingdoms of this world.
In other words, we've been discussing what it means for Christ to be king over us individually, what it means for Christ to be king in himself, the different ways that he is king by nature and by acquired right through the redemption. And now we're going to discuss what that means for society. Is that a fair way of putting it? For
society now, in this intermediate time before he comes back as judge of the universe.
So what it means for human society
to participate in or be subject to
be subject to the reign of Christ.
Absolutely. Okay. And so the two main points for us to address here, Ken, I think will be the notion of the church as a perfect society, what that implies for the relationship between the church and the various civil commonwealths that exist. And then also the error. I think we really do have to talk about the main error against which Pius XI fulminates in this encyclical, the error that he calls laicism.
Yes.
Right? Because it's not only a question of him positively outlining some Catholic truth, but there's also an error against which he's reacting. So maybe those could be the two main themes that would guide our reflection in this section.
As you know, I've been itching to talk about the question of the notion of a perfect society.
Okay,
but we'll
go for it.
So, then why don't we start with a quote from Quas Primas to explain what that means? Okay, the Church founded by Christ is a perfect society, has a natural and inalienable right to perfect freedom and immunity from the power of the state, and that in fulfilling the task committed to her by God of teaching, ruling, and guiding to eternal bliss those who belong to the kingdom of Christ, she cannot be subject to any external power. Quas Primas 31. So what, Canon, does the Pope mean when he says that the Church is a perfect society? Because, as I mentioned,
I thought you were going to tell us.
Let me set the problem before you, because when most of us hear the expression "perfect society," we know that in common language, the way that we use that word, the Church is not a perfect society. Okay, we aren't perfect. There's lots of problems in the Church, but that's not the kind of perfection that we're talking about here.
No, I don't think he's saying if you survey church history and drop a random pin in the 15th century that whatever pope you land on is going to be an exemplar of every moral virtue.
Yeah, definitely
not necessarily saying that.
Yeah, some of them were, but
although the sanctity of the church, though, one of the four notes of the church, the sanctity of the church means that the church possesses all the means necessary to lead us to sanctity, if only we would use them.
Right. And
the church's sanctity is visible in the eminent sanctity of many of her members, the saints who did, in fact, live according to these needs.
But perfection here is not the same thing.
We're not using it in that sense.
No, we're talking about...
This term is not unique to Pius XI. Leo XIII uses it. It's a commonplace in theological language for talking about the church as an institution. But careful here, because there could be an erroneous tendency to see the church as one or the other, right? Which is the opposite of the Catholic approach to things, that either the church is the mystical body of Christ, whose soul is the Holy Ghost and who lives in the virtues and grace of the Holy Spirit by which we are sanctified, or the church is the enterprise based at Rome, and then there's the visible hierarchy. These two things are like the outer shell and the inner soul. They're not two different things, right? And Pius XII, in his encyclical on the mystical body of Christ, emphasizes, that's not the point of our discussion right now, but it's important to know this in order to make sense of all this.
And we went over that in the last segment, that when we discussed the fact that there is identity. They are the same thing, the kingdom of Christ and the church, right? So
they are the same thing. And the church is a visible body with a visible hierarchy, right?
Because an invisible body doesn't make sense.
It would be impossible for the hierarchy of the church to be extinguished, even if at any given moment in history, the members of the hierarchy might be corrupt or leave something to be desired. There always will be a visible hierarchy because there always will be a visible church. And a good bishop or bad bishop can just as validly administer confirmation. In other words, the the church in the bare bones essence of her mission can never fail, can never
Okay.
cease to exist.
But perfect here means something else. It means, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it means a society is perfect which contains in itself everything that it needs to attain its ends.
Right. It doesn't need to defer to some other higher society from which it needs to be activated in order to accomplish its mission.
So to illustrate this on the level of human society,
yes.
because Pius XI, I believe, will also point out that human society, the state, is also a perfect
It's also
society.
a perfect society,
Okay.
which might be even more
Which might be even more difficult for
understand.
us to understand in the common way that we use the word
Yes.
perfect. But so to take the example of human society, a family, although it is the base unit of society, not the individual, as we said in the last the family, although it is the base unit of society, is not a perfect society.
No.
Because no family, however big it may be, contains within itself everything it needs to attain its ends.
To flourish, right, exactly. So there are two couplets of terms we can use to talk about different human societies. First of all, what is a society?
Right.
It's a group of people, but it's more than that, because the people sitting together on a bus, that's a group of people.
Yeah.
They're not a society,
Nope.
right? So a society is a group of people united under a common head for a common goal,
Right.
Now, yeah, sure, all the people on the bus, they want to get to some place, but not all going to the same place. So society is something more. Now, it can be something relatively unimportant and minor. You could have a chess club as a sort of society. They have a common goal. That's why they have statutes and a chairman and things like that.
Any football team is a society with
Sure.
a captain and
Anything like
and a
that,
coach.
yeah.
and
Any
yeah.
and that these would be, the chess club, the football team, those are examples of what we call a conventional society. Right? Some human compact has decided to put them together. The use of some legitimate recreation flows from human nature, but human nature does not say you must play football or you must play chess, right? So there's some degree of choice involved in this. So a society, group of people with a common purpose under a common head, with the means they need to achieve their goal, could be a natural society. Human nature itself inclines us to participate in this sort of society. The family is the archetypal example of that. Right? That's why the war on the family, the disintegration of society has now reached that point in its career that it is a war against the family. Right? Not only a war against the church, not only a war against Christendom, but a war against the family itself. That now we're down at the very building block. But the family is a natural society. Your chess club, your football club, those are conventional societies. The church is a supernatural society, right? It wasn't the case that the early Christians got together, or even the apostles got together after our Lord ascended into heaven and said, we need to do something. We need to keep together. We need to perpetuate his memory. Let's go register at the bureau in Rome, at the imperial ministry of public cults and things like that. No.
Make sure we get our tax exempt
Our
status.
Lord himself founded the church. We talked amply about that last time.
Right.
That's why there is one church. That's why the church and the Catholic Church are one and the same thing, because Christ our Lord founded the church. The church is a supernatural society because its mission, the salvation of souls, is supernatural. It's not just to have a prosperous and happy life, right, that the church exists. It's to save souls. So you have natural society, conventional, supernatural. A perfect society is a very, like in the language of Aristotle, be architectonic. It's a very high level of overreach, which includes under its ambit lower individuals or societies or things like that. The family, for all that it is natural to man, does not have in itself, in the most immediate circle of the family, everything it needs to flourish. Right? You need access to transportation, employment, education of some degree, cultural opportunities. The family, Swiss Family Robinson is not the ideal model for every family to reach a fulfilling form of existence.
Nor is it actually really possible.
No, but I always used to love that story when I was a child. But that's not
That's neither here nor there. But
so you have the family. It's an imperfect natural society.
Yeah.
The state, we can use a different word. You call it the commonwealth, civil society. There are persons, as we discussed in an earlier segment, who have received authority from God. Authority is never for its own sake, whether it's the authority of a father over his family, a priest over his parish, the pope over the whole church, a civil ruler over his country. It's for the common good. Right? It's that he has the power and the right to act in a certain way to direct the action of others for their good, so they can fulfill the nature that they have in that particular circuit. Right? Civil rulers have received authority from God. Right? And we'll talk more in a moment about different forms of government. Is there one that God approves more than others? Speaking about the rights of Christ the King, does that mean we can only have kings in a just society?
Right.
We'll talk about that. But when you have a legitimate government, it has received power from God to achieve the goal of the state, which is the temporal prosperity, peace, public order of that society, but in such a way that it facilitates the true good of man, right, which is a life of virtue and of salvation.
Right.
So between the church and the state, which are both perfect societies, there should not be a conflict.
Yeah.
There should not be. We live in a fallen world. There have been moments in history,
And
there should be cooperation.
we've gone over this many times in this conversation. They're not supposed to be opposed to one another, and so the state, even in its proper end, so that is to say, its own end, and the thing that it does for itself as a perfect society, is also ordered to the final end of man,
Yes.
which is the beatitude of
And
man.
if I may read a small quotation from Pius
Yes.
XI here that is pertinent, he says, "Nor is there any difference in this matter between the individual and the family or the state."
Right.
The goal of directing man towards his true last end. And man is not a schizophrenic being. We do not have a supernatural end in one realm and a purely natural good in another.
Right.
You could philosophically think about human nature as abstracted from man's supernatural destination, but natural man has never existed.
But it sounds like, someone might object, it sounds like what we're getting to here with all this talk about the goal even of earthly society being the beatitude of man, that naturally things should be a theocracy.
Okay.
That human authority, in other words, in the end is always going to necessarily be subject to divine authority, to priests, for example.
So I can think of several examples of which that is one of the most obvious. And let's just go through those objections before we get in more detail about
because this is important.
implication. Absolutely. So in a theocracy, as we said at the beginning of this segment, the kingdom of Christ existing on earth as the church militant does not subsume all other human activity. Right.
Should I read this quote from Pope Gelasius to Emperor Anastasius
sure,
about that?
You could do
just
that.
as a way to...
This is from what? The end of the 5th century?
The end of the 5th century. So this is not 1925.
Not 1925.
This is quite a long time ago. So Gelasius, the famous pope from northern Africa, writes to the Emperor Anastasius in 494, "If the ministers of religion," the priests, "recognizing the supremacy granted to you from heaven in matters affecting the public order, obey your laws, lest otherwise they might obstruct the course of secular affairs by irrelevant considerations, with what readiness should you not yield them obedience, to whom is assigned the dispensing of the sacred mysteries of religion?" Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Give to God what is God's.
He didn't have a microphone, but he could have dropped it.
He could have dropped it had he had.
So theocracy is a system of government in which there is no distinction between religious authority and political authority. That is to say, the ministers of religion exercise the highest offices of the state.
Right.
You have that in Islamic countries, for example. Right.
Iran, for example. But that is not what
that's not what
Pope Gelasius is saying here.
Absolutely not. No.
This is not the basis. This is not the idea. When we talk about the kingship of Christ, we are not saying that every secular government on earth
is just abolished.
Has to be abolished and replaced by a papal nuncio.
No.
Okay, that's not what we're saying.
Now, as a side note, there are accidents of history where, for example, the Pope himself is also a civil
sovereign ruler. Yeah.
In the Middle Ages up through the early modern period, you have the Prince Archbishop of Salzburg, for example. Those are accidents of history in small areas that had a legitimate purpose, right? But that's sort of a side note.
But that's not what we're getting.
It's not right. It's not generically the case that the ministers of religion are to exercise the offices of the state, and this diarchy, right, that the Pope here expresses, and it's an ancient document, establishes a clear principle. But not only does it inform the state authorities how they are to act vis-a-vis revealed religion, but it also instructs, as it were, the church's authorities too. He says, do not meddle with irrelevant concerns.
I love that. What does he say? Irrelevant, obstruct the course of secular affairs by irrelevant considerations.
Right. So, when church and state cooperate correctly, both of them thrive. So, for example, it's not. So there are areas that are definitely under the church's purview. There are areas that are definitely under the state's purview. An example of the state usurping authority would be the so-called enlightened Emperor Joseph II of the late 18th century.
Right.
The sacristan emperor, they called him.
Right.
He would try to regulate the number of candles you could light at church services, whether or not you could use a certain type of wood for coffins, things like this.
Right.
Clearly, a state authority involving itself where it doesn't need to.
That, in passing, we can say it was a different time.
It was a different time, but that's not the model. Right. That's not what we're looking for.
When Christian rulers even bothered about such things, even knew what that was. So that was, we could be nostalgic for a time like that.
The flip side of the coin is, like, for example, let's say I'm a priest we're repaving the parking lot outside of our church, and the local ordinances in a parking lot, it's 10 miles per hour. I cannot say from the pulpit one Sunday, listen, people, this is a Catholic church. I'm your priest. I'm telling you, you can drive as fast as you want in the parking lot because I don't care about the civil laws, right?
Right.
The state, the local township, they have every right to set parking lot speed limits that the church also has to abide by. If I'm building a Catholic school, I'm not going to not apply for a zoning license or something like that.
Let me read a quotation from one of our patron saints, St. Thomas Aquinas, who, as always, says all of these things in the clearest, most illuminating way possible. The secular power, he says, is subject to the spiritual, even as the body is subject to the soul. Consequently, the judgment is not usurped if the spiritual authority interferes in those temporal matters that are subject to the spiritual authority. So, in other words, so that's from the Secundae, question 60, article 6.
You had to check that on the paper? I thought you knew that off the top of your head.
Believe it or not, I did not know that by heart. So the point here being in considerations that are not irrelevant, okay, and this goes back to the letter of Pope Gelasius. Yeah, there are situations where the church is going to have to intervene and say, you know.
But that doesn't make it a theocracy.
But that doesn't make it a theocracy.
Because the rulers of this world, like everyone else, should be baptized. They should be incorporated into the kingdom of Christ.
Right.
And there are consequences for that. St. Thomas here mentions the analogy of body and soul, and that becomes really the classic analogy for understanding the relation between church and state in the Catholic system.
Yes.
Pope Leo XIII uses it again and again. And what is a human person? It's a union of body and soul. They're not at odds with each other, right? The body, for example, cannot dictate to the soul, and you can't engage in gluttony, all sorts of reckless violence to your own person, things like that. The soul, on the other hand, is not. So the two errors, materialism or angelism, right? Plato or Descartes. Our soul is just trapped in our body. We're just using it as a chariot. It's a machine. No, the body and soul together are a composite that make the human person. The soul is the more noble element. It directs the operation.
Right.
When the body and soul are separated from each other, we have a word for that.
Death,
right? But they're distinct, right?
Yes.
They're not the same thing. So it's not a theocracy because there is a distinction between church and state.
Right.
But it's not a total separation.
They have in the classical categories, the classical terminology, we say that there are temporal matters, there are spiritual matters, and there are mixed matters. The most obvious example is marriage. Clearly, the state has an interest in knowing who is married.
Right, they can register that a marriage has happened.
And for even tax reasons and things like that. But marriage is clearly, especially if the two people are baptized, marriage is clearly a spiritual affair. It is a sacrament.
And even in their legitimate interest to know about marriage, the state cannot overstep its bounds. So a funny example, different countries have different laws. In the United States, we still have a fairly just regime about this where you marry according to the laws of the church and it can then be registered with the state.
Yeah.
I served in England as a priest for years. They have an incredibly complicated system where the state will acknowledge religious weddings, but a registrar must come and attend the ceremony.
Right.
And then you have to stop the ceremony, fill out the paperwork after the exchange of vows before you can do the mass. Very complex.
Well, there's also another example is Italy. Italy has an even more wild. So the way that the Italians found a very elegant solution, they make the priest, when he is saying the nuptial mass or when he's celebrating the wedding, the priest is deputized as a magistrate in order to recognize the wedding both as on a civil and
which is sort of a legal fiction.
Yes.
And in itself is an injustice.
Yes.
They should simply recognize the marriage.
Yes.
In France, you are required by law to marry civilly before it is legally permitted to perform the wedding. Now, the church, to avoid greater mayhem, abides by this law.
Yeah.
There could be a case where it's necessary, for example, on a deathbed, a marriage needs to be regularized, that you proceed for the higher good of the soul to do the marriage, even if it's not registered.
Right.
But objectively, it is an injustice, the system we have. It's practically more convenient than the English system, but it is an injustice. One of our confreres told me the story one time. His sister, when she was getting married, she had quite character, went with her fiancé to the town hall to do their civil wedding the day before the church wedding, and the mayor comes and he has his stupid little French flag sash on. He makes a little speech, and then he said
not
to them,
not that the people of France and their patriotism are stupid, but just
not at all. But this self-important little speech that the mayor comes to give is
right in a context that he has no. I mean,
right.
Yeah. There's
so
no
he
reason.
says to the couple, what does this mean for you today? This beautiful thing we're doing here today. What does this mean to you? And she looks at him and she says, absolutely nothing.
Yes, because they're not actually
Because they're not actually married, right?
It's
being civilly married
yeah.
does not make you married.
No.
And to live as husband and wife, if you're only civilly married, that's still the sin of fornication, right? So that's,
by the way,
there's not an objective reality there.
right.
So that's an example of an area where the state and church could both have something to say, but where the state still must not overreach its legitimate boundaries.
Right.
But this passage, irrelevant considerations, the church also has to respect that, because as we'll see when we talk about the practical consequences of the kingship of Christ in terms of church-state relations, there are areas which are not directly under the concern of the church. And the church, if she interferes in those areas, brings disrepute to herself, right? And there are certain areas in respect for the natural law where the church has principles to lay down, and especially on areas of moral life that are prohibitions of the divine law in serious matters, such as the prohibition against murder, for example, whether it be abortion, euthanasia. The church, in reminding us of principle, reminds us that the principle has no exceptions. There are other principles that are general. It should be the case in a just society that there is relief available for the poor. What does that look like specifically? That's not a principle. That's a question of prudence. And the more church men, priests or bishops, whoever the case may be, the more church men make very specific regulations or give opinions about things that are very, very minute prudential issues, they bring the church into disrepute. They lay an unreasonable burden on the consciences of Catholics who say, well, I don't know, I thought this policy was okay. So, for example, the church can and should, even very prophetically, remind us of principles, even areas that are unpopular, but should not get very specific about what should the speed limit be? What exactly should pollution levels be? What exactly should immigration policies be? These are not areas where the church gets involved in very specific things, but just recalls general
While
principles.
those things may touch on certain principles that concern the faith, they are not ultimately the business of churchmen.
Policy making, right?
Right, yeah.
We don't believe in theocracy, and so anything that could unnecessarily give the impression of theocratic pretensions should be avoided. That being said, when principle is at stake, churchmen can and should be prophetic, even to the point of martyrdom, if necessary. And we've seen that in church history.
Yes.
For example, the Emperor Theodosius, right? I guess he had a hot temper. And there was this uprising against him in the year 380 in Thessalonica. He didn't really hold trials. He just executed everyone, right? Milan at that time was the imperial capital. So St. Ambrose was the bishop of the capital of the empire. The emperor was a Christian. He was baptized, subject to the authority of the church. He was excommunicated.
Yeah.
Now, if you're St. Ambrose, you see he's just executed thousands of people. You might be scared to do your duty, but he did his duty.
He did it.
And he made the emperor, before the excommunication was lifted, he made him sign a law saying that when there is a capital sentence to be implemented, there must be a month's delay between the signing of the decree and the actual execution, because you have a bit of a hot temper.
Yeah.
We need to give you time to see if you should cool down. So that's one example. There have been others through history too. St. John Fisher, right? He was martyred right, for witnessing to the truth. Yeah. But even on a smaller scale and more recent history, in the United States, some bishops have started working up courage to correct politicians who support things like same-sex marriage and abortion, as they should. Because here we're talking about not a policy that is very difficult prudentially. We're talking about principles of right and wrong in areas where there's a clear and universal prohibition in the moral law. Yeah. But in 1962, that was the last time that a politician was excommunicated by name. So excommunication means you're still a Catholic, you're still baptized, you haven't committed the sin of heresy, but you have committed a grave delict. That's the canon law term for a crime. And therefore, you may not receive the sacraments until you have done the necessary penance and the sentence has been lifted.
By the way, for your own good.
For your own good. It is medicinal, right? Yeah. It is medicinal. Yeah. So in 1962, 3 politicians in Louisiana supported objectively unjust segregation laws. And the Archbishop of New Orleans excommunicated them by name. I don't know what the aftermath of that history was, if they repented or not. But the fact that in 1962 an archbishop had the moral courage to do that, and it was an unpopular position for him to take. But today we don't have exactly the same response for things like abortion that are objectively graver, shows that we need to pray for the gift of fortitude right, in the hierarchy of the church.
We definitely do. And but again, the point is that the doctrine of Christ the King, the doctrine of Christ's kingship over society, is not the doctrine of theocracy. and it's also not the doctrine of what is commonly called the separation of church and state. When you take that expression to mean that,
and we'll probably get more to that in a second.
Right.
But for the theocracy,
it's
I want to
not
raise another
theocracy.
objection for you to answer,
Yeah.
though. Monarchy. Right?
Yeah.
We're talking about Christ the King.
Yes.
We're not saying Christ the elected parliamentarian.
Right.
Is this doctrine of the social kingship of Christ inherently tied to a particular form of government, which, let's face it, is not practiced in the modern world?
Right.
So is this all just, nostalgia?
Yeah, and we brought that up in the last segment concerning the theology of the kingship of Christ. So yeah, is this just tied to a specific form of government? The question, and we answered that by saying no, it's not. This is a biblical principle. Christ's human kingship is by analogy with divine kingship. Now here the question
So Christ, in other words, he couldn't be Christ the elected president.
No, because but
an elected president
the question
could.
here, but the elected president could be a ruler perfectly, or of someone who holds the power of government temporarily in perfect keeping with the principles of the kingship of Christ. So the question here is whether the form of government is something that is legislated by these principles, like whether the
what's
form
your
of
answer?
the form of government is no, because human government has taken many forms, even in the historical books of the Bible.
So if you were to channel Aristotle in politics, what basic three forms can we reduce the regime to?
Okay, well now you're putting me on the spot, but I know that one of them is a republic.
And we can use different vocabulary,
yeah,
but based on the number of people who hold a power.
Right. One of them is a republic. Another is a monarchy, which he actually calls it a tyranny, doesn't he? Or he says that monarchy degenerates into tyranny if it's poorly exercised. And in the third,
you have the aristocracy.
The
So you have the one, the many, or the few.
Right.
And each of them, as you said, can degenerate. So monarchy could become a tyranny.
Right. And then it's very funny. He says a republic can degenerate into a democracy.
Right.
And
so we can update the line to call it mob rule, right?
Mob rule, right. And an aristocracy can degenerate into an oligarchy.
Where it's just moguls who are running.
It's just exactly right. So, but the form of government is not what's being for a society to obey the social doctrine of the church, to recognize the kingship of Christ, does not mean that society necessarily has to have a king.
Right.
Now, that being said, monarchy has certain advantages because it ends up formalizing something that happens anyway in every system of government, whether it's a parliamentary democracy or a strict autocracy, which is that there is always ultimately someone in charge. Okay, so that there is that reality of things that is never escaped. I mean, you look at a communist. You look at China now. You have a communist society. It has a king,
right?
Whether they call him that or not, right? So and there are other examples that we can use now. The point is that the kingship of Christ is not tied to that form of government. Monarchy has certain advantages because it resembles the way, says St. Thomas Aquinas, that God governs the world. And in the question of the Summa, which I can't remember now, I can't remember the exact reference, which discusses the perfect form of government. St. Thomas asks himself, well, what is the ideal form of government? What is the form of government, I guess, most pleasing to God? He ends up what he actually ends up coming up with is an elected Catholic monarchy with an aristocracy whose members are chosen because of their virtue. And then he says, and so that's the perfect form of government in the Thomistic view of government. But then he says, and this is important. Then he says, but in reality, the best form of government is the one that you can actually realize in the time and in the place where you live. Right. And I think people might find both of those statements surprising. They might find it surprising, on the one hand, to find out that one of the greatest thinkers in the church's history conceived of ideal human government in a way that resembles more closely, in some respects, originalist American constitutional democracy.
It's not entirely surprising because in politics, the virtue that is most operative is the virtue of prudence, what you can actually achieve.
Right.
So in practice, it's going to be some form of a mixed government, probably.
Right. But it's interesting. I think some people might find it surprising that it looked like what he described as the ideal resembles in many ways on a practical level a little bit more the ideal form that our republic is supposed to take than Louis XIV. Right. I think some people might find that surprising. Right.
So in the late 19th century, when Pope Leo XIII wrote an encyclical to the bishops of the United States about the progress of the church after 100 plus years of the American experiment, he praises the wisdom of our founders. He praises the Constitution, singles out Washington for particular praise. He said it would be better if this system that in itself works well were consecrated by adherents to the Catholic faith publicly, but as a system, it's very good. And of course, he's the great promoter in modern times of the study of St. Thomas Aquinas. But what you're saying really is that the church is not too hung up on the form that a regime takes, if it's one or many.
That was the second thing I was going to say, is that the second thing that might be surprising to some people is that the form is not really that important to them. There are some advantages to some forms and disadvantages to others, but the point is you can be submitted to the reign of Christ in the time and the place that you are with any system of government if it respects the principles we've been discussing.
And so, according to those principles, a state would be legitimate to the extent that the rulers promote the common good, not their own particular good, which would make a tyranny or an oligarchy or mob rule, and that they foster the true liberty of the church, the extent to which they at least allow, or even better yet, promote the mission of the church. And there have been examples in history. Obviously, we have a whole phalanx of canonized kings and queens. It's not surprising because they also, their position is consecrated by a sacramental. They're anointed in a particular way to serve, which is why it's not surprising that in the immediate aftermath of the French Revolution in Europe, which is the heart of the old Christendom, that place in which the kingship of Christ as a model historically had most been achieved, that there would have been an effort to restore the monarchies after they were toppled. That's very understandable. It doesn't mean that in a country that never had a monarchy, you go and try to institute one. Right. Because prudentially, a country's own national character, their history have to be determining factors.
At least you have to say that something like that would have to happen naturally and not by imposition from the outside. But
so we can't just say, well, if your country didn't exist in 13th century Europe, you're off the hook. You don't need to obey Christ the King.
Yeah,
right? No, it's for everyone. And there have been examples in the 19th century, the Republic of Ecuador, President
Moreno,
consecrated his country to the Sacred Heart of Jesus.
Yes.
He was assassinated by Freemasons in the cathedral one day. Right? So, but he was a president of a republic who fostered the
and we have had presidents in our own country who were quite virtuous and who recognized at least give lip service to the supremacy of Christ in human affairs, and the founders, even though they created a system that could also be lived in by people who were completely secular, they recognized implicitly, this isn't really going to work unless the people are virtuous and believe in God. And so there is but the point is that the form of government is not what Pius XI is talking about here.
So we've seen that kingship of Christ in the world does not mean theocracy.
No.
In fact, it's the contrary. It does not mean a particular form of government. One other objection that comes to mind, though, Canon, is, isn't this all a bit utopian? Are you really telling me, and Pius XI is saying that the world will not know true peace until all nations submit to the yoke of Christ the King, that if we do that, then everything's just going to be okay. Here in this fallen world, this valley of tears, everything's just going to be perfect all of a sudden.
Well, no, because that's not going to happen until Christ returns in glory to restore everything. I mean, the world is going to be the world. The world's going to world. All right, so that's just how it's always going to be. Right. However, this will be this is a way just as you and I, because we're baptized, because we're priests, and because we want to follow our Lord and we want to have Him be King of our entire lives. It doesn't mean that we never deviate from the implications of that. It doesn't mean that we never commit a sin, unfortunately, right? But what does it mean? It means that we have made a decision to have Christ reign over us, and it's going to be easier for us. It's going to be better because we try to be united to Him, and there may be stumbles and difficulties along the way, but the fact that we have personally that we personally desire to submit to Christ as King is going to make things better. And the same is true by analogy for societies.
Right.
Is okay, let's say a society decides to overnight become, if America overnight, the entire populace converted to Catholicism and wanted to become a Catholic confessional state that respected the best things about our Constitution. Do I think that after doing that overnight, there would never be any tragedies or problems or disasters? No, because human beings are human beings. Do I think it would help? Yeah,
Right.
I do.
So this is not utopianism.
No.
It's just like St. Thomas teaches, man can always be tending towards greater charity,
Yes. Yeah.
even if he does not yet possess perfect charity.
Exactly, and it has to begin somewhere. I always find it, the people who raise the objection that you just pointed out tend to be the same people that think, as I made reference to in another segment, they tend to be the same kind of people who believe that some kind of meaningful peace is going to be achieved by the United Nations, for example. That is utopian, okay? Because that is utopian.
Yes.
Whereas at least with submission of societies to Christ as King, who wants to rule over us with gentle strength, right? With gentle force, that really will change societies. Yeah. It has changed societies, by the way, Ken. And I know this is a bit of an excursus. You and I, the people who make some of these objections, they can scarcely imagine the state of things before Christianity came into the picture. The barbarism, the cruelty that existed in pre-Christian societies, that the church, through this very imperfect attempt to be faithful to Christ the King, the church took centuries to mold us into the disaster that we currently are, right? So can you imagine how much worse it would be if there's that. Never mind. There's that famous quote of Yves Lenoir, who was a
daily communicant.
Daily communicant,
yes.
A convert to Catholicism, English author that many of our listeners may be familiar with. Anyway, he was known for having a terrible temper, and he was very grumpy and difficult. And a woman said to him, "Mr. Waugh, you call yourself a Catholic, but you're a monster." And his response was, "Madam, can you imagine how much worse I would be if I wasn't a Catholic?" And that
kudos to your accent, but it's also a very revealing line.
But
yes.
that is really what we're talking about here. So no, is is the attempt to do these things, is that going to solve everything overnight? No, but it's going to help.
Right. So, having answered those objections now, before we take leave of this section on the church as perfect society in her rapport with the kingdom of man, just one other clarification is that this church, the Catholic Church, is a perfect society. She has at her disposal everything she needs to fulfill her mission. The state is a perfect society, having what it needs to promote the mission of temporal prosperity and peace. Ideally, should support the church in her mission. One clarification, though, is that although the Catholic Church as such was founded by God himself, right? When we say that the state is a perfect society, we are not implying that Christ our Lord founded directly the Kingdom of France or the Republic of Ecuador or any particular country. In the Old Testament, there was the theocratic Kingdom of Israel that God himself established, as it were, by giving the law directly. In the New Covenant, there is this distinction between church and state. Legitimate authorities, whether it's in a democracy, aristocracy, monarchy, being legitimately designated to exercise authority, they receive authority from God. It does not mean that God has established any particular world historical state. Yeah. And we don't know what the map of the world will look like on Judgment Day. Which republics, which empires will still be existing at that time? They're going to come and go. That's the way of this world. The church, and we have in Daniel this passage about the vision of the statue the King Nebuchadnezzar saw, representing the different world empires, how they're all brushed away, but the one that remains is the mountain, which is the church.
Right.
So the state is legitimate within its own purview, but no particular state as such is established by God.
The church, which has also preserved all the things that were good about those other, Rome,
and certainly nations have different providential roles in history.
Yes, but just everything that's not baptized eventually disappears.
Yes.
So the church in its love of humanity, right? The has preserved those things about human societies which were good. Rome, as great as it was, would not be remembered today in the way that it is, would not survive in our institutions in the way that it has if it weren't for the church, which supported those things in their proper sphere, it divinized them, so to speak, made them. And so there are many things about ancient Rome, including its language, that were saved because of its connection to Christ. And the same will be true of our republic. The same will be true of any nation that is joined to Christ. If we want those things that are good about it to survive, if we want their identities to survive, they must be united to Christ.
And that point that you make is we are now on the cusp of celebrating, and patriotism is a virtue, we will celebrate the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding. Mm-hmm. But there's no hiding the fact that we were running on fumes for a long time. We're now in a state of almost total, but not total because it's still increasing, social disarray. Mm-hmm. If we want another 250 years, it needs to be under the banner of Christ the King.
That's right.
We need a Catholic America, and that's what we need to be praying for in this upcoming anniversary year of our country.
So Catholics, so Americans, if you want this great country to be what it was meant to be and what we would all like it to be, get baptized. And if you are baptized, go to confession.
This is Our Lady's country, right?
It's Our Lady's country, that's right.
So, Ken, now we have the second major point to cover in this section, and that is the error that the Pope designates in this encyclical. Question first of vocabulary. So he uses terminology. What is the bugbear of this encyclical?
Okay, so the bugbear of this encyclical is laicism. Now,
in Latin?
In Latin, it's laicismus, and on the Vatican website they translate this as anti-clericalism, and it's like, well, okay, I guess
that could be an aspect of it.
Or secularism.
Secularism would be a better translation.
Would be a little closer, like this idea that there's only the worldly aspect, that God doesn't have anything to do with it. It actually comes. The Latin word is actually a calque of the French term laïcisme, which is this idea that of what we discussed before, the total separation of church and state, that they have nothing to do with one another, and even more than that, that the secular authority, whenever there's a conflict between the church and the state, takes precedence. Mm-hmm. What it says goes, and the church has to bend, has to bend to it. It's the idea that the church should have no say in the life of society, no authority whatsoever, even in things that appertain to its proper sphere.
So anti-clericalism, which has certainly existed in history, there's still remnants of it, is more of a symptom, though, than the essence of this era of secularism.
Right.
Like the expulsion of religious congregations in France and Germany in the 19th century, countries that banned the wearing of the cassock in ecclesiastical dress. That's anti-clericalism, but it's just part of secularism.
Right.
Secularism is the idea that religion, particularly the true religion, should not have a role to play in the public square.
Right.
And it can come in a softer form,
right,
where you say, oh, no, you Christians, you can go to church, you have freedom of worship within the four walls of your church, but don't act like a Christian in the public square. So the privatization of religion, and then the harder form of secularism is actual persecution of the church and religion.
So it's like, do whatever you want in your churches. This goes back to so I'm just going to read a quote from Quas Primas here, Quas Primas 32. Nations will be reminded by the annual celebration of this feast, of the feast of Christ the King, that not only private individuals, but also rulers and princes are bound to give public honor and obedience to Christ. Okay, so again, the point is, religion is not a private affair. Okay, it's not just something between me and Jesus. Okay, it is something that pertains to our public life. It should be. That is the normal state of things.
If he really is who he says he is.
If he really is who he says he is,
otherwise.
It cannot be otherwise. And a society ignores that reality at its own peril. Okay, and so it isn't. So Leo, here's a quote from Leo the 13th. It is an evil thing for the commonweal wherever Christianity does not hold the place that belongs to it. When Jesus Christ is absent, human reason fails, being bereft of its chief protection and light, and the very end is lost sight of, for which under God's providence human society has been built up. This end is the obtaining by the members of society of natural good through the aid of civil unity, through always though always in harmony with the perfect eternal good which is above nature. But when men's minds are clouded, both rulers and ruled go astray, for they have no safe line to follow, nor end to aim at. From Tametsi, number 8.
Which I believe was his encyclical on the Sacred Heart for the Jubilee of 1900.
Right. So, and we've gone over what he said there, but again, the point is it's not to be pushed into the realm of private observance only.
So another clarification I'd like to make, which hopefully will clarify all this a little bit more, is when we use the expression church and state, we've been talking about that. In American civil discourse, we talk about there are those who ardently promote a strict separation of church and state, right? Those who talk about, no, there should be more of a public role for religion. But either side, they use church and state as sort of a general slogan where the word church is just a convenient placeholder that means religious institutions.
Yeah.
Right? It means the Catholic Church, but it means
right.
Christian denominations. It means mosque and synagogue. It means even now, because a logic is followed to its endpoint, groups like the Church of Satan are saying, well, if they can put up a nativity or 10 commandments, why can't we put up whatever horrible idol we have? So in church and state, as we use it in America, church is just a catch-all. It means religious institutions. Again, as a Catholic, we cannot mean the same thing.
No, when we say church and state, we mean the church.
Right. Because there is only one church that is a perfect society founded by Christ that thus has a standing vis-a-vis the other perfect society. Right.
Funnily enough, the state is actually the more generic of the two terms. So
right, because the state could be France, could be the United States, could be Bolivia, whatever.
Right, but there is one church.
There's one church.
When we say that the separation of church and state is an anti-Catholic principle, we're talking about the church qua church. Like the church is the Church of Christ.
The church is not one denomination among many, and they all relate to the state authority as a private association. John Locke, of course, very influential in our founding documents. He says something like, a church I conceive to be that religion which men decide for themselves to be most apt to enable them to worship the supreme being, something like that.
Absolutely not. And we're also not saying that religious liberty for Catholics is sufficient. Okay.
The reason Catholics have the right to worship God as we do is because he has the right to be worshipped as he has prescribed.
Right.
Right. So that's an important principle.
Very, very important to understand that, because otherwise you get into a lot of...
So now that I just wanted to make that clear. We say church and state. The only church that has an objective standing vis-a-vis civil authority is the one, in fact, that Christ has founded as a perfect society. Just another, if you permit, a brief quotation again from this encyclical that we're discussing, Quas Primas, a brief historical survey where the Pope explains how we got to where they were then. Now, of course, we've gone further.
Yes.
He said, then gradually the religion of Christ came to be likened to false religions and to be placed ignominiously on the same level with them. It was then put under the power of the state and tolerated more or less at the whim of princes and rulers. Right? So this is the sort of progressive degradation, right, from the authentic notion of the participation of church in public life and how secularism has gone further and further and becomes always more violent. To end this section, Ken, maybe we could just talk about, because it's all been, not entirely, there were some historical samples, but maybe some people might find it still abstract. In the realm of the abstract. Yeah. What does it look like for the state, for a true, virtuous human society to acknowledge Christ the King and his kingdom? What would be, let's say there are steps towards implementing this.
Right. So, but just before we do that, so we already established what it doesn't look like necessarily is any particular form of government, a particular people or anything like that. It's not tied to any of that. It's tied to a set of steps, principles, as you say, that have to be present so that we can say that a church is really recognizing Christ as King. What is the foundational step? Respect for the natural law.
Because implicitly we're saying we don't have that right now.
We don't have that right
Currently
now.
We don't have that.
So how do we
might
get
have had
there?
it to some extent in the past, but we don't have it now.
What is step one? And by the way, the step one is it's just one of
the threshold.
It's just the threshold. It's where it's the baseline. It's where we start, and that is respect for the natural law.
Okay,
that God has established.
Earlier on in the series, we talked about the scandal that exists now of Catholic politicians. I'm personally opposed, but they'll do photo ops going to mass or with their rosary, but without shame, they'll vote for same-sex marriage or even perform such a thing. They'll vote for abortion and they'll go to communion afterwards. It's form of dishonesty, right, to say I can't impose my religion on others. Because when we're talking about things like abortion and euthanasia, this is the natural law. It means it does not depend on revealed truths. Like we're not saying, you so-and-so, do you approve of a law that requires Protestant men to remove their hat when the Corpus Christi procession goes by? We're saying, do you think people should be allowed to slaughter their unborn children, right?
Yeah.
The natural law is that which reason itself has access to, and which addresses the principal precepts of the natural law, which are summarized in the Ten Commandments, but even before God revealed the Ten Commandments, that was already part of human nature.
Right. And to be
it's
clear,
not denominational.
No. And to be clear, in our society, this aspect of things is not going well. Okay. Some things that are non-negotiable under natural law. Okay. Before you even get into the question,
and this is the expression Pope Benedict often used.
Yes.
The non-negotiable principles.
The things that are impossible in a society that respects natural law, okay, are things like abortion, euthanasia, same-sex unions, and the like. And we say this as
the right of parents to educate their children.
The right of parents to educate their children. We say things. We say
those rights
things,
don't come from the state.
No, they do not.
Inborn.
And a state that allows those things to go on, or usurps those natural rights, does so illegitimately. Okay, it exercises a power that does not belong to it, and it offends even against reason when it does it. So that's the baseline.
Right. We have the fourth commandment. Right?
Yeah.
We're taught to respect our parents, but authority in general.
Yeah.
Right? What happens? So laws, they permit things, they command things, or they forbid things. Sometimes those things line up exactly. They can't line up perfectly. Even St. Thomas says the state cannot prudently outlaw every single venial sin, for example, right? That would be prudent. But these major baseline things have to be respected. When the state...
To get a ticket for gossip.
Can you imagine? The state, if it forbids something that God commands, right? We obey God rather than man. It says, no, you can't go to Mass. Well, that's not a real law because it's against God's law. If the state's law permits something God's law forbids, it's true they're not forcing you to have an abortion or something like that. Some other countries they do. But that means, okay, fine, so you as a Christian, you don't take it, you don't fall into the trap of thinking if it's legal, it's moral, but you also do everything in your power to change that unjust law.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So you don't obey an unjust law, you don't accept the permission given by unjust laws, right? So I think it's important to understand that it's not the law, human law, which has the authority to bind consciences. Right.
But it's super important that law be in conformity with the natural and divine law, because, people do pay attention to the law. There are more abortions since abortion was made legal. More people believe that abortion is okay since it was made legal. More people believe that a same-sex union is a marriage because it's now recognized in our laws. And that's why one of the reasons... Okay, but let's say we have all of that in line. Let's say that we respect everything in the natural law.
Here, though, in this realm, we're in the zone where the recent popes the last 40, 30 years, this is what we're talking about, the culture of death versus the culture of life.
Right.
We're talking about these basic natural law principles.
Let's say we respect that.
Let's say we achieve a culture of life. Does that mean our work is done?
Is that enough?
Is it enough?
No, it's not. It's not, for a couple of reasons. First of all, because we are unable to even obey the precepts of the natural law, like of the perfect natural law, without the help of grace, of the natural moral law. The Council of Trent said that the grace of the redemption is not only elevans, so raising up, but must also be sanans, that it heals. Since the regenerated Christian, though cleansed from original sin, from the guilt of original sin, still suffers from the effects of original sin, from the effects of the fall. And by analogy, the human society cannot adhere to the moral law without the guidance of the gospel and the teaching of the church. So the moral law is not enough. This
principle that Pius XI has touched on more than once is that what is true of the individual applies by analogy to society.
Right.
That's an essential principle.
And just as we cannot really even observe the moral law without the help of Christ and his grace, in the same way a society cannot either.
And grace, for the individual man, grace is the life of the soul. By analogy, for the commonwealth, the public influence of the church functions as the soul of the commonwealth.
Right.
The the recognition of the gospel, the moral law.
But the second reason why the natural law isn't sufficient is because man...
And before you, I just want to emphasize very strongly here that it is not enough to seek only the fulfillment of the natural law, because we cannot fulfill the natural law without the help of God's grace and the public witness of his church.
That's the first point.
And if you look historically, so we're not just totally abstract, Christian states that even up through the early 20th century had an official Catholic constitution, right? Mm-hmm. They said, but that means that missionaries from Protestant sects, they didn't have the same right as Catholics, and that's not very nice. Couldn't we just get rid of that, but we'll keep all the natural law? You look at a country like Spain today, right? Mm-hmm. Abortion, same-sex marriage, legalized divorce, blasphemy is rampant. It's not possible just to keep the natural law without the restraining force of God's healing grace.
Right.
And that's true for the society and for the individual.
Right.
But it's a pipe dream to think we can have a just society that just respects the natural law, and Catholics and everybody else, they can all participate, but we're just going to have the natural law, right? Not possible.
No, not possible. But the second reason is because to think that way, that we can just have the natural law, ignores the fact that man has a supernatural vocation. He is not, in fact, called to a purely earthly beatitude, a purely natural moral rectitude. That is not, in fact, the world that God created. The world that God created is one in which man has a supernatural vocation, mm-hmm. to be united to him by grace, to become a member of the church, to become a member of Christ's body, and thus to realize in his person, both individually and as a society, the kingship of Christ. To say that more clearly, to truly accept the kingship of Christ. And so therefore you can't really just have this aspect of the natural law.
Okay, so then there's another level of goalness in implementing the social reign of Christ the King. Baseline, you have the natural law, but the next step is there is some form, mm-hmm. and that will depend on mm-hmm. the culture and the constitutional organization of a given country, but some form of public recognition of the kingdom of Christ, which is the church. So some form of recognition of the Catholic religion.
So of divine law as it is promulgated through the gospel and through the church, right. Which is the guardian and the expositor right. of that law.
Now, in the old Christendom, there were very obvious public markers. Things like, for example, the head of state, who is the king or the empress, is consecrated mm-hmm. by the representatives of the church. They swear a coronation oath to defend the church, to extirpate heresy. Okay, that might not apply in every single political setup, but at the bare minimum, it would be things like, and even more recent documents like the New Catechism of the Catholic Church say, it should be the goal of Catholic legislators that Catholic holy days, in addition to Sunday, be recognized as public holidays. Right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. So the prerogatives of the church to the detriment of other religions.
Right. So this second step is there's some sort of formal recognition of Catholicism, since the church is the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
Since you have to protect the common good against that which can threaten it, right? Because the common good that the state defends should also facilitate that highest common good, right? Mm-hmm. So anything that could threaten it, to some degree, is also going to be prohibited, right? We don't allow murder. We shouldn't allow abortion. Anything that could threaten the Catholic identity mm-hmm. of a just state that we just talked about, mm-hmm. sort of the next level, that's perhaps more controversial, but there would be not an absolute liberty as the world understands it today. Right? The liberty is for something. Right? Mm-hmm. So,
and so
anti-blasphemy laws, for example.
Anti-blasphemy laws, and I know people don't want to hear this. Which we used to have in the United States, and I know people don't want to hear this. I know that this is very. Some people might not want to hear this. I know that this is very contrary to some of the principles of freedom that we, especially as Americans, hold very dear. But the reality is, if Jesus Christ is who he says he is, then the church that he founded is what it claims to be. And if it is what it claims to be, then it has certain rights over the individual and also over societies. That is to say, at the very least, it cannot be treated the same. It cannot be on equal footing with false religions.
So historically, the practice and the teaching of the church in this matter is that to protect the common good in a Catholic society, in other words, most of the people are in fact baptized. They're members of the state and they're subject to the power of the church, is that the public activities of false religions are curtailed to the extent that they threaten the common good, which is to say the mission of the church, unless some greater disorder would be the result. So you can imagine if it's going to cause a civil war, that happened in France 16th century, then toleration, right, could be permitted. That's the prudent thing to do, therefore the virtuous thing to do. But the more tolerating evil in itself is not a good, right? It's something you do to avoid a greater evil, right?
In an ideal world where that wouldn't be, where it wouldn't cause a civil war, for example, we wouldn't have the same level of toleration. Just to say things very, very, very clearly, right? So the church would have rights. Church should have rights that other religions do not.
Right. What hath Christ to do with Belial? Again, if Christ is who he says he is, if his reign has consequences, that means something, right? On the other hand, the church has always taught, and that's why, again, we do not feel the need to acknowledge these false objections about theocracy, things that you mentioned. The church has always taught the gift of faith is something that is freely accepted. So although for the common good of a Catholic state, the dangerous activities of false religions can be curtailed, it has never been the teaching of the church that it is legitimate, on the contrary, to force a person to adopt the Catholic religion. Because the act of faith means that the will moves the intellect to accept as true what our Lord has revealed and is taught by the church. An internal grace moves you to do that. External force cannot produce an act of faith. So the church, that's happened in history. That was an abuse, right? We're not utopianists. But the church has always taught that that's not what we mean here. Right?
Man remains free in this area.
In the act of faith, he's psychologically free.
Yeah.
Not morally free. It's still a sin deliberately to reject the true religion.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
But the act of faith involves psychological freedom. So the church is not saying, and never has said, you force people to embrace the faith.
Right. Which is not what Pius XI is saying here. He is, however, saying that states have a duty to recognize the kingship of Christ in the way that they exercise their authority, in the way that they deal with Christ's church, in the way that they formulate their laws and execute their judgments. It is saying that.
Right.
And that is today very controversial.
That's something today that most Americans not heard. It made most Catholics not heard that, but it shouldn't be intrinsically shocking to us, to our patriotic sentiment.
No.
Historically, when this country was founded, it was a mixed bag. There were founders who were Masonic deists. There were others who were devout, committed Protestant Christians.
There was one Catholic at least.
One Catholic who signed the Declaration. But of the 13 original states, 8 of them had an established church.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that.
The First Amendment, by the way, as Catholics, we believe in the First Commandment even more than the First Amendment.
Yes.
But let it be said, the First Amendment said that Congress shall make no law with respect to the pre-practice of religion. State constitutions were allowed to do what they wanted. 8 out of 13 had an established church. You had the Anglican Church in Virginia, Congregationalist Church in Massachusetts, in some places that lasted to the 1830s. That was not against the Constitution. It was not against the First Amendment. Obviously, in none of these original 13 states was it the Catholic religion that was established. Only 2% of the population was Catholic. But that is to say that our Constitution, as a wise political ordering document, is not incompatible, right, in our country and its context with the rights of Christ the King.
With this vision of the practical reign of Christ in society.
Many states had anti-blasphemy laws. You could not go around insulting the Blessed Trinity. That was illegal. It wasn't covered by free speech. So this shouldn't be shocking, but we have a sort of also not only theological but historical myopia.
But it is shocking because we're in this to some people today, because we're all affected by this modern revolutionary spirit, whether we want to admit it or not. It's a consequence of being born in the time that we've been born in. However, we should know that we need not be afraid of the sweet yoke of Christ. He has come not to take something away from our society, take good things away from our society, but to elevate, divinize, help, and foster them, including the rulers of our societies. They should not be afraid of embracing the kingship of Christ in the way that they govern. Christ has not come to take their crowns away, but to strengthen them. If they are loyal to Him and subject to Him, from whom all authority ultimately comes. How could that fail to help them in the prudent government of the societies that have been entrusted to them? So, Yeah, and we, dear faithful, we should also not fear to have Christ rule in our own hearts, in our families, and in our societies. That's the goal. That is it's the goal of our institute. But more importantly, it is the mission of the church on earth. This is a truth which has been forgotten nowadays, unfortunately, also by many within the church. And I'm glad that we were able to have this conversation about it.
Well, on that note, Canon, thank you very much. I think that certainly that gives sufficient food for thought to the people concerning the doctrine of the social kingship of Christ. And we can pick up in the last segment talking about the liturgy of the feast, because after all, it is the liturgy which expresses and reinforces our belief, including about this topic. So
that's right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Canon.
Amen.